Stephen Hawking, whose name I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the famous cosmologist, doesn't think there needs to be a creator. And he suggests that the world simply popped into existence out of a vacuum of nothingness. And that vacuum of nothingness I came to learn as I read this book, and I began to read as he talked to all these different physicists and cosmologists who were working on the beginnings. The vacuum of nothingness is really important. They all speculate, and their theories lead them to believe that there was this vacuum of nothingness, and the nothingness has a very definite definition of what it means. But Hawking's theory is that the simplest explanation of why that nothingness didn't hold and why there is something rather than nothing is that nothing is inherently unstable. And so, in the theory that the instability of that nothing point led to eventually a predictable cosmic pop, a fluctuation. And within 1 second, the universe was the size of an atom, and then within a few minutes, it was enormously expansive, which is just mind-boggling to think about. But it was that cosmic fluctuation that got everything started. And there didn't need to be a creator in Hawking's telling of it. That nothingness was just there, and then it was bound to happen at some point in time. Some prominent physicists think there was something before the Big Bang, and this is where, when I'm reading this book, I'm thinking, this is where science and science fiction begin to look an awful lot alike. Because the things that are being speculated now about the universe and the universes that are out there is just like the science fiction I read when I was growing up. Some prominent physicists think that there was something before the Big Bang. And to illustrate their thinking, he tells the story in the book about the philosopher Bertrand Russell, who late last century was giving a talk on cosmology and explaining cosmology and what it meant in terms of what it meant to philosophy. And he was talking about the beginning of the universe, and this woman popped up, and I've read the story several places. Everybody talks about this in the field when they tell these stories. This woman stands up, and she says, "This is just total rubbish." She says, "Everyone knows that the world is actually flat, and it is supported by a giant elephant that is standing on the back of a turtle." And Russell humors her and says, and who's supporting the turtle? And she says, "It's turtles all the way down." And she sits down. And he goes on to make the point then that this actually gets to the philosophical idea that some of these physicists are working with, that there is no beginning point. He interviews Andrei Lindy, who's a Russian physicist who immigrated to the United States in 1990 and teaches at Stanford. And this is another thing, this is an aside that comes out of this book, he interviews all these physicists and talks about Einstein and all these absolutely brilliant people. They work things out in their mind. And it's amazing to me how later so much of it then pans out. But they have to wait. And some of them don't even get to see it happen in their lifetimes. But they work it out in their mind, and then they have to wait for the science to actually catch up with them. And this was the case with Lindy. As a young man, he came up with what was then the novel theory about the Big Bang that's known as chaotic inflation theory. And he accurately predicted the exact pattern of background radiation that would be left from the Big Bang that eventually was proved in the 1990s. And his interview was fascinating. He said, what's interesting about his theory is that it doesn't take all that much to create a universe. Lynn says, When I invented the theory of chaotic inflation, I found that the only thing you needed to get a universe like ours started is 100,000th of gram of matter. That's just enough to create a small chunk of a vacuum that blows up into billions and billions of galaxies we see around us. It looks like cheating, but that's how the inflation theory works. All the matter in the universe gets created from the negative energy from the gravitational field in that little vacuum. And does Lynn have any idea why it happened, or is there someone out there who did it? And Lynn says, those who work with the theory can't rule out the possibility that our own universe was created by someone in another universe who just felt like doing it. And he says, he goes on to talk about it. He says, in the theory that's the standard theory we're working with now, he said it's possible to think about the possibility eventually of some scientists creating in a lab another universe. And that maybe somewhere in some other universe that's what happened, and that's why we're here. If the inflationary scenario that's standard today holds, our universe is about 14 billion years old, and it essentially bubbled out of the space-time of a pre-existing universe that was itself billions of years old. So it's turtles all the way down. There's just one universe after another, billions and billions and billions and billions of universes after another. There are multiple universes in existence occupying, well, that's the other part of this, that the theory they're working with suggests that we're not alone, that there are other universes out there, that it's possible that more than one universe is bubbled up at different places and different times, and that there are parallel universes around us in different wavelengths of the space-time continuum. And which is just crazy to think about. It is really like science fiction. One of the interesting observations I made as I was reading this book is that the prominent atheist scientists who are out there selling books and taking the fight against mostly Christians are mostly not physicists and cosmologists. Most of them are evolutionary biologists who are fighting the battle against creationists who want to deny the theory of evolution. I mean, they're all familiar with the other science, but their battle is mainly about evolution. And in that theory of evolution, of course, they argue that there's absolutely no need for a designer to have created anything. But the physicists and the cosmologists he interviews are much more circumspect about whether they will say, if there's a beginning, there's something behind the beginning. He talks to one prominent physicist who also teaches at Oxford, David Deutsch, who's a friend of Dawkins. And he says, I don't think an ultimate explanation of reality is possible, including the God question. None of our laws of physics can answer the question of why. Another physicist he talked to said, it was impossible to answer this question, and he said, I think we are at least 5 Einsteins away from getting close to being able to answer these kinds of questions. And then another one he talked about, just changed the subject, and he said, think about what we know about consciousness. He said, we are just now beginning to know a little bit about human consciousness and what it's all about. And he said, until we begin to understand human consciousness, we have absolutely no hope of understanding those other big questions. And they all may be, he said, eventually we may find that they're all tied together. But we're a long way from an answer to it. One thing that's clear to me from reading this book is I know why so many people rejected the science. It's hard. It's difficult to understand. And, the quantum mechanics, the uncertainty principle, the theory of relativity. One of the scientists talks about how long it took the best minds in science to accept those things. And what a leap in order of imagination it was from Newton and the law of gravitation and that kind of scientific thinking to the next order of thinking, where you have a space-time continuum and more levels of reality. And it's extremely difficult to understand. And you can't think logically. I mean, you have to do science that follows logical steps, but you get to a point where the logic begins to break down and you have to begin to think in a different way. And most of us just have no interest in doing that. Don't have the time, don't have the interest. I mean, it's much more easier to think about D caused by C, caused by B, caused by A. And A's the big guy in the sky. I mean, that's the way most of the world would like to think about it. And all these people who are doing this work are brilliant, and I'm not. And so it's just easier to not think about it and to find a simpler answer that feels good, that is comforting, and that seems to explain enough of what we need to know so that we can just get through today and get to tomorrow. I think it's worthwhile, once in a while, for us to try to understand some of the science. To me, part of it is walking the talk. Because if we say we value the science, if we do think that science should be taught in schools, and our kids should be learning it, then I think it's worthwhile for us every once in a while to sit down and actually read some of it. And to try and understand a little bit more about what science is telling us about the way the world works. And I also think it's valuable every once in a while to think about the question of why. Why is there something rather than nothing? And why are we here? And this is where every one of us has to take that bit of science that we know and have come to know and take our faith perspective, whatever that faith perspective is, and however we think about God, and ask the question, how does it all work together? And if someone comes up to me and asks me a question, what do you believe about all of this? What would you say? It's turtles all the way down? I don't want to talk about it? We don't think about it most of the time, and I think it's okay. I think it's okay to let other people think about it, but I think it's also good once in a while for us to listen to them and then to think about what it means. How is it changing our world? And does it have any impact on my everyday life? And those are the kind of questions I was thinking about as I was reading this book. It's a difficult book to read if you don't know the science, and I don't that well. But he has great stories to tell. I mean, he gets to know a lot of these scientists, and he gives a wonderful descriptions of how they look and how grumpy they are, and what they eat and what they drink and what he had to buy them for dinner in order to get them to talk and all this, how much liquor he had to ply them with before they would talk to him, and he did have to with a lot of them. But he's just very gifted writer. He can boil the science down into language that you can understand. And so if you're looking for a book to read about science and the beginnings of the universe, and where he's talking to all these people who are thinking about it, it's a good book to read. So thank you for listening. Next week it's poetry.